Good morning and welcome to our conference on confronting Christian nationalism with our guest speaker today, Amanda Tyler, who is the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee in Washington, D.C. She has been serving in that capacity for the past 4 years. The work of Baptist Joint Committee is defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by the government. In other words, the First Amendment of the Constitution is of special importance. In most recent years, Baptist Joint Committee has been involved in work that is trying to protect against the targeting of religious minorities, the politicization of our houses of worship, and the rise of Christian nationalism, which we'll be looking at specifically today. Amanda is a native of Austin. She got her education at Georgetown, where she received a bachelor's degree, and then from there went to the University of Texas School of Law, where she got her law degree. She has spent her work in the practice of law, serving as a law clerk for a U.S. district judge in Dallas, and then on the staff of U.S. Representative Doggett here in Texas, who represents the Austin area. Her work with Baptist Joint Committee began early while she was going to college as a volunteer, and then eventually as an assistant to the general counsel, and then would come back, as I said, 4 years ago, to serve as its executive director. I approached Amanda last year about doing something dealing with the rise of Christian nationalism. And part of the reason that I was talking to her, because in the year 2019, Baptist Joint Committee led in the formation of a coalition called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And when we started that conversation late in 2020 about putting together a conference like this, we had never anticipated something like the events that occurred on January the 6th, which I think only has intensified the need for us to know how do we confront Christian nationalism, especially within our congregations and houses of worship. So Amanda is going to give us some insights of how we can go about doing that in a very positive and productive way today. During this time of her presentation, if you have some questions that you would like to ask at the end of her presentation, we'll give you a chance to post those in the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And you can post your questions there. And Marv Knox, then after Amanda's presentation, will sort of collect those questions and form them together and ask questions, as many as we have time to handle, of Amanda and get her response to that. So we ask you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat, because that's the format that we will be using to handle questions. The second thing that you might want to also look at your chat feature is that Amanda, in her presentation today, will sometimes be referring to different links where you can get information, and those will be posted in the chat as well. And then we will be recording this presentation today, and we'll try to make that available to you for future use. If you would like to maybe use portions of this in your congregations as maybe sort of a group time together even. So we're very excited to have Amanda here with us and to present this very relevant information for us today. Amanda?
Well, thanks so much, Rick. It's really wonderful to be with you all. Thank you to CBF Texas, Fellowship Southwest, Faith Commons, and of course, Christians Against Christian Nationalism and BJC for bringing us all together. And thank you to all of you for your interest in joining us. I am going to share my screen as I have a presentation for us to kind of orient around today. As Rick mentioned, I am executive director of BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We are located in Washington, D.C. And if you are learning about us for the first time, maybe today, I'd encourage you to check out our resources on our website, bjconline.org. Here are all of our social handles that you can check us out on, and you can also subscribe to get updates from BJC. And Josiah Masters, who works with me at BJC and who helps coordinate our Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, is going to be posting different links in the chat today. So I think before we address Christian nationalism or how to talk about Christian nationalism, we first have to know what it is. So I want to provide a working definition for us today. So Christian nationalism is a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge our identities as Americans and Christians. As we think about Christian nationalism, I think we should talk about some of the markers of Christian nationalism. It really relies on a mythological history of the founding of the United States as a, quote, Christian nation. This is an idea that not that we are majority Christian, but rather that the nation was founded to privilege Christianity in some way. It's also an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism, and it has a real emphasis on God's providential hand in both American history and in present politics. I think we also should try to differentiate what Christian nationalism is from Christianity. As I said in the opening definition, Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework. It's not a religion. The Christian in Christian nationalism is really more about identity than religion. But I don't think we can just say, oh, it's not Christianity, because it does link to Christianity. In fact, it uses Christian language and symbols in the way that it expresses itself. So it's something that Christians in particular, I think, need to take seriously because of its obvious, even in the name itself, its obvious connection to Christianity. In differentiating Christian nationalism, I think we also talk about Christian nationalism versus patriotism. They're not the same thing. Patriotism, I'll define here as love of country, but nationalism is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including to Jesus. And so when those are the words when I talk about patriotism and nationalism, those are some of the assumptions that I'm making today. Now, Christian nationalism is something that has actually been studied by a number of sociologists of religion. And I'm going to point throughout the presentation to the research of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who are two of the leading researchers on Christian nationalism. And in their polling, they have identified a number of questions that help them notice or identify Christian nationalism in the population. And so they've developed a survey that has a number of questions. These are some of them. They found that Americans who embrace Christian nationalism strongly agree with statements like these, that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, that the success of the United States is part of God's plan, and that the federal government should advocate for Christian values. And in polling, they ask questions like or make statements like these and ask people, do you strongly agree somewhat, disagree, strongly disagree? And in using very large samples of this, they were able, in work that they wrote for a book that was published last year, they came up with these 4 orientations of Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is a spectrum, and it's an ideology that pervades American society. And so we are all, because we live in this society, touched by it in some way. They found that about 1/5 of the country rejects Christian nationalism. Another quarter or so resist Christian nationalism. Around a third accommodate Christian nationalism, and about a fifth, again, are ambassadors of Christian nationalism. And so I cite to the book here. I would really recommend the book for people who are interested in a much deeper dive on Christian nationalism from an academic perspective. But I put up this slide to show that, and throughout this presentation, and what I would advise as you talk about Christian nationalism in your communities, to talk about the ideology, not to label people as Christian nationalists. It's one, it's not very helpful to dialogue, and two, it's not accurate, because we all kind of find ourselves on a spectrum of Christian nationalism. And this shows you that really the majority of the country are somewhere in the middle, right? They're not at one of the polar ends. I think that sometimes when you look at the ambassadors of Christian nationalism, this is the group who has most fully embraced the ideology. Those people might be more likely to be labeled as Christian nationalists, but really that's just about a fifth of the country. And so I think it's more helpful to talk about it as an ideology. We also need to talk about Christian nationalism and its intersection with racism. You know, some will say that you can't understand Christian nationalism apart from white Christian nationalism, that they're really one and the same. And others will struggle to see a connection at all. And still others, just like this research on Christian nationalism itself, will find themselves somewhere on the spectrum between those two polar ends. And so as part of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, we came up with this statement that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. So why is that so? Why do we see these intersections? And I think part of it is the way that Christian nationalism relies so heavily on this history, on a particular version of American history. And of course, our American history is so steeped in slavery, in white supremacy, and segregation. So when we idealize this history, when we think that God had a providential hand in founding the country the way it did, then it also talks about God's, involvement in racial subjugation, God's involvement in white supremacy, as if that were an order that God wanted in some way. And so there are lots of deeply rooted connections to racism and Christian nationalism, which I think are really important to explore. But the statement tries to provide this state as an introductory conversation to that topic, understanding that a wide, different diversity of Christians who are wanting to resist or understand Christian nationalism might come at this question from a lot of different ways. I also think that Christian nationalism and racism are similar in that these are forces in our society that pervade our society. So just like it's not very helpful to try to identify people who are racists, because we're all living in a racist society, it is not very helpful, as I said, to identify people as Christian nationalists, unless instead, if we can think of these as ideologies that are really pervading our society, that's more helpful. So now that we've kind of got some definitions and understandings, how does Christian nationalism show up? Rick mentioned Christian nationalism was part of what was going on at the Capitol on January 6th. It's not everything that was going on there, but there were definitely Christian symbols that were used. There was a overtly Christian prayer said by the insurrectionists in the Senate chamber. A lot of the people there felt called by God to be there and said so. They attached messianic significance to Trump's presidency and thought that it was God's will that Trump be president. So all of these are markers of Christian nationalism that were at play as one of many other forces that went into the insurrection on January 6th. This is not the only example of deadly Christian nationalism. We can also look to October 27th, 2018, which was the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which killed 11 people and wounded 6 and was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the United States. We can look to June 17th, 2015, and the killing of 9 people, wounding of 1 at Mother Emanuel AME Church. These are examples of how Christian nationalism in the hands of a violent extremist can turn deadly. But we want to note these sometimes get our attention the most, but there are many more mundane examples of Christian nationalism that we also need to pay attention to. This is a picture of a wall of a school in South Dakota from 2019, because in 2019, the legislature in South Dakota passed a law that said that the words "In God We Trust" had to be placed prominently on in every public school in South Dakota. And this is part of a larger project called Project Blitz that tried for state legislatures. This is something that's still going on today. State legislatures to pass bills that really have a lot of Christian nationalism latent in them. So this is an example that not everything that is informed by Christian nationalism is unconstitutional. So the question is not, is this constitutional? The question for us is, does this promote religious freedom for all? And just straight from the Project Blitz is an organization that actually they have a book that they called a playbook to give to legislators to encourage them to pass these bills. And here's the language straight from the Project Blitz playbook, that these measures for "In God We Trust" are meant to solidify the foundation set by the founding fathers, who established this nation on the belief that we have certain inalienable rights that are endowed by our Creator. More than just a motto, though, "In God We Trust" is our country's foundation, an important part of our identity as Americans. So you can hear some of these markers of Christian nationalism in this language. Posting of "In God We Trust" is an acknowledgement of our country's history and founding principles. So, part of our work at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is to raise awareness of the broad spectrum of manifestations of Christian nationalism in our culture, and to help question some of these assumptions that, again, are repeated, attaching this kind of important significance to a mythical history in the United States. Here's another example of Christian nationalism. This is a 40-foot cross on government land in Bladensburg, Maryland. The constitutionality of this cross went all the way to the Supreme Court in a 2019 case called American Legion versus American Humanist Association. The cross was completed in 1925 to honor 49 servicemen who died in World War I. And then in the 1980s, it was rededicated to honor everyone who had served in that community in World War I and in subsequent wars as well. It began as a private individual effort, but since the 1960s, it's been controlled by the government. And so the court, as I mentioned, reviewed it of whether it was an unconstitutional establishment of religion. And I included in the presentation here, not to go over all the specifics of that court case, but to talk about it as an example of Christian nationalism. Because here you've got a preeminent symbol of Christianity being used to stand for patriotic sacrifice, this merging of our identities as Americans and Christians. So what could go wrong here? Well, in addition to alienating those in the community who are not Christian, not everyone who has served in war is Christian, it also tends to water down or strip a religious symbol of its meaning. In this particular case, the US government argued that the cross was not a religious symbol, that instead this cross is just a generic symbol of sacrifice. So this is what can happen to our religion when it's co-opted by the government for other ends. And so that's why it is not just a concern on behalf of religious pluralism, it's a concern to Christianity itself. And so now I'm going to get really close to home, really politically hot issue, and that's whether to have an American flag in your sanctuary. I have a feeling that a lot of leaders and lay people on this call have dealt with this very question. But I pointed out as an example that Christian nationalism can come into our very houses of worship. And Josiah is going to put in the chat a resource that we have at BJC on this very question, like, should you have a flag in your sanctuary? Again, this is not a constitutional question, but it is a question of Christian nationalism, because especially in our house of worship, are we worshiping the flag that's on the altar here? Are we saying that our citizenship in God's kingdom is equal to our citizenship in as United States citizens? There are theological questions that I think are raised by this particular example of Christian nationalism. And so I raise it just to point out how many different ways that Christian nationalism might come into even our house of worship. So, you are all here to talk about confronting Christian nationalism in your congregation. So, I think the important question is, why should we confront Christian nationalism in church? Like, this is, why is this an important thing? So I have, 4 reasons that I would suggest that it is an important thing for the church to take on. One, that our congregations are already a place of community, of authentic relationship, and of accountability, of holding each other accountable in our walk with God. And so I think often, as I've talked about, Christian nationalism is so entrenched in our society. It is not going to be uprooted by posting an article on Facebook. I think it's important to get information out there, but how we're really going to get at some of these root causes is through conversation, one-on-one relationship. And you and churches have already built these relationships. And so this is the perfect place to have these kinds of conversations. And second, in church, we are committed to being disciples and to growing as individuals and as Christians. And this is the kind of work that is required to really understand and root out Christian nationalism, not just in our communities, not just in our churches, but even in ourselves, that there's a way that we can grow closer in our walk with God by confronting Christian nationalism and understanding it better. Also, I think church needs to be a place for truth telling. I think this issue of truth has come up in new ways after January 6th, when we have a lot of conspiracy theories at play. But there's a lot of myth and half-truths and sometimes even lies that underlie this idea of Christian nationalism. And so it's important in our walk as religious people to live into that calling by not just calling out the big lies, but as David French, a conservative commentator, recently wrote, calling out the enabling lies as well, to have a more truthful approach to Christian nationalism. And finally, Christian nationalism is a threat to Christianity. It really waters down Christianity. It perverts it in many ways. And so it is in the interest of the church to understand and to root out Christian nationalism. And so for all of these reasons, were why BJC and a number of other religious leaders felt that it was important for us to take a public stand against Christian nationalism in 2019. And we formed Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which you can find at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. The Christians Against Christian Nationalism project is meant to provide resources to raise awareness about Christian nationalism, to understand how it operates in our communities, and to root it out. We really think that Christians Against Christian Nationalism, that the centerpiece of it, and I'm going to go through it in some detail this morning, is a statement that we think is an opportunity for civil dialogue among Christians who disagree on many different policy issues. You will not find in this statement hot button policy issues. You will find unifying statements that really reflect an understanding of religious freedom for all that we think can bring together people from a number of different places. The development of the statement and each of its bullet points can be unifying, again, across denominational lines, even across partisan lines. And it also offers a basis for really needed dialogue with non-Christians who have been targets of Christian nationalism. Many of the statements affirm longstanding principles of religious freedom for all. And the feedback that we've gotten from this statement, which again has been live for about a year and a half, is that this language really helps people understand Christian nationalism better. And it provides a perspective that's uniquely Christian on this topic. And so I want to encourage you to check out the statement. If you haven't yet, to sign the statement, share it with others, and to feel free to use some of this language, whether you're giving a sermon, even as talking points in conversations. That's what the purpose of this statement is. You can use it all together, or you can just take out certain statements for a particular conversation you might be having. And so I wanted to shape the conversation today about how you might use that statement. So I'm going to give you a series of quotes that you might hear in conversation, you might hear in your congregation, and how some of the statements in Christians Against Christian Nationalism can help respond to that. With one exception, which I'll note and actually note the source, these are all made up quotes, but they might resonate or remind you of things that you've heard before. So the first one is, secular leftists just want to label everyone a Christian nationalist to strip God, Jesus, and religion out of the public square. This is actually a version of this is something we've heard quite often over the last month or so as more and more people are talking about Christian nationalism. And so we kind of anticipated this very argument. The very first statement on Christians Against Christian Nationalism is, people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. We absolutely think there's place for religion in the public square. This is one of the key misunderstandings by some about what separation of church and state means. That phrase was never meant to take religion or religious people out of the public square, as if that were possible. Instead, it's talking about the institutions of religion and government, that those shouldn't be mixed. But in fact, we think, and as reflected in the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project, we think Christians have a particular responsibility to speak up when it comes to Christian nationalism. And while we all have a right and responsibility to engage, we think this particular campaign is so needed because some who have spoken for Christians in the past have actually exacerbated the problem. So we're not, as I said, we're not calling names, but we're not calling out Christian nationalists, but we are taking our place in the public square to have a dialogue about Christian nationalism with others. So talking about Christian nationalism is not meant to silence anyone. It's actually meant to start a conversation. So you might hear something like this. I'm not a nationalist. I'm just a patriot who loves God and loves my country. What's wrong with being patriotic? Well, here's some language from Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. After kind of defining what patriotism is and defining what nationalism is, you can also talk about, if your patriotism is causing you to sacrifice your theological convictions, then that's not patriotism. That's nationalism. Patriotism doesn't ask you to stuff down your religious convictions or to sacrifice those for power. And so having that's another problem with Christian nationalism. When you merge faith and country, it's often more problematic for the faith than the country. The powerful country is going to come out on top. So having that conversation and having a deeper dialogue about what patriotism really is, we think would be helpful. And there's also some more information on the website in our FAQ section on Christians Against Christian Nationalism that can help unravel some of this response as well. So you might have heard something like this. The United States is a Christian nation, always has been, and God willing, always will be. It's important that our leaders reflect Christian values. So here, I'm going to take people to the Constitution. I think this is a good place to start. And when people talk about the U.S. as a Christian nation, I always go straight to the U.S. Constitution. And this is just a restatement of it. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. This is really just a restatement of Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. Religion or religious is mentioned exactly once in the U.S. Constitution, and it's to say that there shall be no religious test for public office. So I think the best rebuttal to the U.S. as a Christian nation is that our founders were really inept at setting that up. because the way that they set up our country is that you didn't have to be a certain religion or religious at all to hold public office. So going right to the documents can help have that conversation. And again, you're not going to win this argument on the Christian nation. There's lots of anecdotes on one side and anecdotes on the other. We definitely had religious people in public life, but going back to the foundation of the country might help with an understanding there. Here's another statement. Most of the people in the United States are Christian. Why wouldn't we want our government and elected officials to promote and protect our faith? Again, going back to the Constitution, the government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. This is really a restatement of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The founders, learned from their failed experiment of state-sponsored religion, not just in Europe, but also in the colonies. And so they set up a system where government would stay neutral when it came to religion. And that's something that non-established denominations and religions, including Baptists, but many others, they fought for that protection. And this protection is increasingly important as our country becomes even more religiously diverse, including with non-religious. Here's another statement you might hear. Everything went downhill in the 1960s when they took God out of the public schools and told our children they couldn't pray anymore. So there's a lot going on in this statement that has some shortcuts on constitutional law when it comes to religion in the public schools. But here's one approach that might work. Religious instruction is best handled it's best left to our houses of worship, religious institutions, and families. And, I think that this is sometimes helpful. Like, do we really want our state indoctrinating our children in religion, in any religion? That's really something that's better purview for our private lives, whether it be our houses of worship or other religious institutions or families. And this goes not just about prayer in school and some other examples of Christian nationalism, but again, from that Project Blitz handbook that I talked about earlier, there's been a push to pass Bible literacy bills. And these are bills that, again, could possibly pass constitutional muster, but are very steeped in this idea of Christian nationalism, that it's important to teach our children the spiritual values of our Christian heritage. And I think that as religious leaders, we can talk about how uncomfortable that makes us for the state to be instructing our children in religion at all. So this is the only statement that I have an actual quote or a citation for. Only God could deliver such a savior to our nation, and only God could allow me to help. God bless America. So this was from President Trump's campaign manager back in April of 2019. It's not unique just to President Trump. I think there are other religious leaders that are sometimes endowed with some kind of providential call to ministry. And I think any of this is quite dangerous. And our statement, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, puts it this way: conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. So, I think it's really helpful, particularly in church, to have theological conversations about what dangers Christian nationalism poses, not just to our neighbors, but to our faith. And I had a conversation, I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in a moment, our Christians Against Christian Nationalism podcast series, but I had a conversation with theologian Walter Brueggemann, who really talked in a very eloquent way about the power, and the government is the power figure here, wants religion to have a very anemic God. We want to limit God in ways that the government can control, and how damaging that is from a theological perspective to how we consider God. So anytime that religious authority and political authority is conflated in some way, any kind of messianic, attribution to some candidates rise to power or the importance of keeping a certain candidate or political leader in office, that this really is a matter of idolatry and something that should be called out by religious leaders. So we know that these principles can have a unifying impact, and that's because of the response that we've gotten to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative since it launched. To date, we have about 21,000 signers from more than 6 dozen different denominations. Now, these are all individuals, but when they sign up, they can list how they self-identify, and it is from those self-identifications that we've drawn this sampling of the broad diversity of religious life that has endorsed this project, again, through individual Christians. So this is not something that is, just a progressive movement, but from, more conservative denominations. It's not just urban, it's from rural and suburban, and it's from all over the country. So we really do believe that these principles, these statements can bring common ground to Americans and Christians who are pretty deeply divided right now, and certainly something that we hope can do. So I hope that you will visit Christians Against Christian Nationalism. If you haven't signed, sign. If you're in a church, share these resources with others in your church. Encourage all of them to sign as well. There are social media resources that you can use in your social media feeds. And there are other resources if you want to have conversations. I mentioned the BJC podcast series on the dangers of Christian nationalism. It's a 10-part series, and we've also put out a discussion guide. So if you wanted to have a small group discussion to go deeper onto each of these episodes, that's available again on the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website. We also had a webinar with Andrew Whitehead, who I mentioned earlier, who goes more into his research, along with Bishop Curry of the Episcopal Church and Bishop Eaton of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Really wonderful conversation about some of the theological dangers of Christian nationalism. And coming soon, we are working on a 2-part like Bible study series or something for your small group that uses the webinar as a jumping off point for more discussion. So that will be coming later this spring, but another resource that you can use in your community. And finally, if you're interested in really going deeper, having a book study perhaps, or just studying on your own, I mentioned Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry's book that takes a more academic direction. And then Robert Jones has written an excellent book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, that goes much more deeply into some of these questions about white Christian nationalism that I raised at the beginning. So with that, just a final reminder about BJC resources, and I'll stop sharing my screen and am eager for any questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Amanda. My name is Marv Knox, and I'm a coordinator of Fellowship Southwest, one of the sponsors, and we really appreciate that. And I'm giving you a little time by saying a few other things in the next couple of seconds, but to invite you, if you want to post any questions right now for Amanda, right now is the time to write them in the chat, and we'll moderate that in a second. I do want to specifically mention, in case they flew by you and you missed it, the sponsors of this webinar, BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, Rick McClatchy, who introduced us earlier in Texas, CBF Texas, and then Faith Forward Dallas and Faith Commons, and also a tip of the hat for Cameron Vickery for making this possible, receiving your registrations and putting this together, and all of the BJC crew. Also, just a second, if you have not listened to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism podcast series, it is an enormous resources, and you'll want to do that. And then also to subscribe to Amanda and Holly Holman's BJC podcast that she mentioned too, that keeps you kind of up to date. So a couple of questions, one of which I've already kind of answered online, but step past it. We are going to post this video. We'll make it available. It'll be on BJC YouTube, I believe, and we'll push it out through Fellowship Southwest. The other question was, Amanda, though, is the PowerPoint available? Can folks get access to that?
I'd be pleased to share it if that would be with this group. in case you weren't able to jot everything down.
Okay, we'll work with BJC and follow up on that. Thank you so much. And then let's see here. Another one is, do you know of any individuals or groups who identify as former or recovering Christian nationalists?
Well, I don't know that I've heard that term exactly. I would say that one thing, people who, again, I'm going to use Whitehead and Perry's term, ambassadors of Christian nationalism, those who have most thoroughly embraced it, do not identify as Christian nationalists. So it's not something that people really claim much as a label. I will say that in the wake of January 6th, definitely seen more and more people who had not previously raised some of these concerns coming out, and doing so because I think they were really shocked by the scale of not only the insurrection, but also the scale of how much evidently Christian nationalism might have played into the actions of some of those who actually took part in violence at the Capitol. And so I mentioned, I quoted David French earlier, a conservative commentator who has written quite a bit in the last several weeks on the topic of Christian nationalism. I signed a letter that a number of others, evangelical leaders, signed last week, again, specifically directed to calling out Christian nationalism and denouncing it on January 6th. But they have a website. I think it's Say No to Christian Nationalism. And I'm not suggesting that the people who signed it would have previously identified as a Christian nationalism, but many of them were taking a public stand for the first time. So I do think we see people taking this much more seriously in the wake of the violence, which I think is a good thing. And I think that we are doing a disservice if we focus too much on its most violent examples and not look at some of the more mundane examples that I mentioned in the presentation.
Okay, thank you. One question has to do generally with looking at this through the Catholic lens and particularly white Catholics, and what kind of synergy is there for working this cause alongside Catholics, and then that raises a second question maybe, and that is, why is it so important that this is Christians against Christian nationalism? We have this is an interfaith group on here today, and so maybe that one first. Why Christians speak up to this first, and then the second one is, what kind of synergy are we developing with other groups, among them Catholics?
Yeah. So great questions, both of them. When we started out, most of the projects that BJC works on are interfaith in nature. We work in coalition and often work with minority religious groups and with secular groups on topics like this. So we kind of went first to our best interfaith group and said, what would you think about doing something? This is back earlier in 2019. What would you think about doing something on Christian nationalism? And they said, we think it's a great idea, and we think we are not the ones to do it. And so we quickly pivoted to, this is a Christians against Christian nationalism, because one, it's the biggest problem among Christians. Again, you don't have to be a Christian to embrace Christian nationalism. Whitehead and Perry's work shows that. But most of the people who do espouse it do claim some part of Christianity. And so we felt like, and as I mentioned, Christian nationalism poses a huge threat to Christianity itself. And so for those two reasons, we felt like it was important for Christians to speak to this. The movement I mentioned earlier is really focused on evangelicals, and I think that that's an important place for this as well. But we wanted a broadly ecumenical movement, one that wasn't just, one piece of the Christian world. And so our statement was really drafted, and of course we didn't draft it alone. We shared it with many different people, but it was meant to be as broadly inclusive of Christian language as possible, so that people who came, who were Christians in a broad array of different ways could sign themselves to the statement. It's, we're Baptists at BJC. We are not fans of faith statements. So this is not a faith statement. This is a statement really about religious freedom for all. It's a statement against Christian nationalism. And so for those reasons, that's why we did this in this way. And we do have Catholic signers on the list. And this was always a grassroots movement. So we are not here we didn't seek, denominational sign on, or we didn't seek a sign on from some of the institutions. These are individuals signing on. And so my hope is that this appeals to Catholics and Protestants alike, and all different walks of Christians. And we certainly have those in the signers of the statement.
Good, thanks. So a question is, do you have examples of this dialogue opening doorways for people to shift their views away? You kind of gave us some ideas, some talking points to keep in our pocket, but how effective has it been so far? Have you seen people move along that spectrum from ambassadors back toward rejectors?
Well, I certainly have heard anecdotes, right? Not data here. We'll leave that to the sociologists of religion, but I certainly have heard anecdotes of how helpful this language has been for individuals to understand it and to start conversations with people. That the point is not to be accusatory. The point is to inspire some generous dialogue. And I have heard that it is useful in that way. And I think this is a long-term project. Christian nationalism has really been part of the American experience from the beginning. In that Christians Against the Christian Nationalism podcast series, we have a whole episode on kind of the history of Christian nationalism. And some of the experts talk about it, how it really took root in the generation after the founding. So, we're talking about more than 200 years. We're not going to change this ship, in a single conversation either, but it's the kind of thing that if there are more and more of us talking about it, raising concerns, understanding that to be against Christian nationalism is not to be against Christianity. In fact, the opposite, that one reason we're calling out Christian nationalism because we're concerned about our Christian faith, that will help change mindsets, change hearts and minds. So I think this is long-term work. And we hope, again, very much a dialogue. We hope that these can provide tools to open, and that we can source each other, that we can share information on what works best, what doesn't work as well, where are we seeing progress, how can we do this, and acknowledging, just like that, those orientations of Christian nationalism that I put up earlier, that the ambassadors, those who have most fully embraced it, it's going to be very difficult to disengage Christian nationalism there. But understanding that the majority of the United States is somewhere in the middle, that there really is more hope there to kind of move that, and not to be discouraged maybe by some of the more some of those who are more entrenched in Christian nationalism.
Okay. Interestingly, we've had several questions and comments about flags, both Christian flag and the U.S. flag, and then another one that I'm tying to it is civil religion. So would you speak a little bit about the whole flags in the sanctuary, and then also, is this, I think the question was, is it a product of, or an end result, an extreme of civil or civil religion in the United States?
Yeah. So, I did, go ahead and just put the third rail up in the presentation. I know that taking the flag out of the American flag out of the sanctuary can really end careers in some way. So I get that is, but I think it's an area to just have a conversation about why do we have a flag in the sanctuary? What is important about this to us? It might be that the congregation decides that, it's not an idolatrous symbol, right? But I think broaching the topic and not in thinking about and having a dialogue has benefit to it, even if the flag remains up there. I'm not passing judgment or suggesting an answer, but to interrogate some of these assumptions that we've made. And that resource that I shared kind of has some ways to get around that. Maybe you put the flag up on certain holidays, maybe you put it up with other flags, but thinking about that Christianity is not an American only religion. It is something that unites us with Christ followers around the world, and acknowledging that in different ways, I think, can be useful. I don't know what the question about the Christian flag was, but it was striking that the Christian flag was carried into the Senate chamber by one of the insurrectionists. And so this idea of just how these merging of these identities can be, which is really at the heart of what Christian nationalism is. Civil religion is distinct from Christian nationalism, I believe, because I think there are examples, when we live in, I was revisiting some of these statistics today, now in public surveys, about 70% of the American public identifies as Christian. In the 1970s, that was about 90% of the US. So that's a pretty big difference, just in the last 50 years of how many people identify as Christian. But it wouldn't be surprising in a country that is 90% Christian to hear Christian references in speeches, to see Christian imagery in the public square. The problem we get is when there's a signal sent that you can't be a full American if you don't embrace this faith. That's where civil religion starts to tend into the Christian nationalism territory. So I think it's something to watch. Again, it's not about scrubbing religion from the public square as if we could. I think that there's importance in people. Religious freedom includes the freedom to bring your religious self into the public square, and it's something that we very much defend. But are we sending a signal because of government action in some way that you're not welcome as a full American if you're not a Christian? If so, that's a problem, and that becomes Christian nationalism.
Man, there are a lot of good ones. You guys started slow and then you really took off with these questions. So one of them that I'm looking at right now is, do you see a connection between Christian nationalism and the belief in conspiracies? And if so, what's the connection? QAnon, election, all of those sorts of things.
I don't know. I mean, as I mentioned, Christian nationalism relies on a lot of myths. And I use myth, and there's a lot of good stuff that Stephen Green, a historian, has in the podcast series on this. I use myth not in a pejorative sense, but in a way that is not an entirely truthful sense. Conspiracy theories to me seem to be, at least in their founding, more intentionally untrue. And so I think there's a difference between myth and conspiracy theory here a lot. And I do think that we've seen some association in recent months between those who are buying into conspiracy theories and maybe those who are ambassadors of Christian nationalism. So there might be a correlation, but I'm not exactly sure what the connection is between those two things. But I do think that an antidote to both of those are some of those things that I thought are really the hallmarks of church: community, relationship, truth telling, discipleship. All of those things I think can help counteract both conspiracy theories and Christian nationalism.
What about there's a sense of which there's a lack of values, ethics, and morality that's been compromised in government. I mean, then seen maybe from the left and from the right and from the center. How do you bring a conversation on ethics, morality, and spirituality to the public square while maintaining a separation of church and state and calling out Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that that's part of a calling as Christian, right? Is to bring our faith-inspired ethics into the public square. The problem is when that turns into legislation that is meant to further that religion in some way. And so I think the separation of church and state, again, is the separation of the institutions of religion and government. So the idea that the state doesn't try to do the job of the church, or the church doesn't try to do the job of the state. I think our laws in all ways are they're moral documents. And so it would not be surprising if our laws reflect some of our ethical positions, including our ethical positions that are inspired by religion. That is not a problem. The problem is when we try to use the power of the state to promote religion for religion's sake. And that's where we start to see the blurring of the line. But, I hope what people might take away from this, all of this talk about religious freedom and Christian nationalism, is that it's not always so binary. There's a lot of gray area here. There's a lot of nuance here. And I think that that's important to conversations around these topics.
Thank you. So I think we've probably got time for maybe one more. And so I'll throw a caveat to everybody. If I didn't ask your question, don't blame Amanda, blame me. And we just couldn't get to them. But the last one is idolatry tends to mask itself in religious garb, but Christian nationalism will possibly use patriotic garb to mask itself too. So in what ways are you seeing this ideology mask itself in new ways? Sort of like the way racism is sort of shifted over the centuries. How are you seeing Christian nationalism shift, and maybe even right under our noses?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to give an example that comes to mind, and how, and I think this is related to racism in many ways. And if you recall, I talked about Christian nationalism providing cover for white supremacy. So the state of Mississippi, the voters there recently voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from their state flag, which is, I think, a really important move towards justice. The state legislature, when they were putting this ballot initiative up for the voters, they said, okay, we'll let the voters vote whether they want the Confederate battle flag. But if they vote to remove the flag, they have to put a design that says, "In God we trust," on the flag. And so they're using some of this language, again, that's in some ways civil religion, because it's this idea of God in not a Christian specific way. But to take it on as a symbol of the state on the state flag, to say that, again, this is more tied to identity than religion. This is a kind of a way to, I think, shapeshift some of those same views that led them to put the Confederate battle flag. This idea, well, if you're with us, if you're in Mississippi, then you trust in God. And all of the layers, again, of that cultural framework that we were talking about, that is carried in that phrase. And so I think that that's some ways that we've seen this shift, is to try to use, again, something that might not be Christian specific. This is where we also hear talk about a Judeo-Christian ethic, something that was created, right? This idea to make something seem more pluralistic than it is, when there's still kind of this very set idea of what that identity looks like.
Good. I lied. I'm going to ask one more question. Now I got to find it. How can we talk to our politicians who, when expressing their own personal faith in Christ, very much seem to be speaking for Christian nationalism?
Well, I think I would encourage you to speak to your elected officials. As Rick mentioned, I worked for a member of Congress for 8 years, and it's really important to them to hear from you. And so I would encourage you to reach out and to say, I applaud, if you feel led to, I can tell that, your religion is very important to you. And I fear sometimes when you talk about it that you don't make a disclaimer that makes it clear that people who don't share your faith are welcome, or that you represent them, that I've elected you to a secular position. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about your faith, but when you do so, I would appreciate it if you would not send a signal that to be an American, one has to be a Christian. I think, again, sharing Christians Against Christian Nationalism as a resource to them, and to let them know, like, I also share your faith, and I worry sometimes that some of your language sends an exclusionary tone that, again, I'm sure you don't mean to to send, to be generous with them. And I think that building that kind of relationship might be really, really helpful.
Thank you, Amanda. We are all so grateful to you for being with us today and helping us out and dealing with this. Probably everybody on here sits next to, when we sit in church, somebody who believes very differently than we do, or when we call mama, we talk to somebody who believes very differently than we do. And so this is tremendously helpful, and we're grateful. And I'm grateful for all of you to be online. Cameron just told me some just got on, and we realize we're spanning time zones. So if you just got on, or if you want to revisit this, it will be, go to either BJC's website, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, or fellowshipsouthwest.org, and you will be able to get access to this. So thank you for being with us. Keep up the good fight. We are grateful to be walking alongside all of you all, and particularly BJC and Amanda. Thank you so much.